Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Robert Doar, and I am the Mortgage Fellow in Poverty Studies here at AEI, where I focus on our nation's large safety net programs and how free markets and strong families can best foster economic mobility and opportunity. American ideals like economic mobility and opportunity have often been part of an empty promise for Black Americans, who in the decades after the successes of the Civil Rights Movement have still struggled to move up the economic ladder. And often, when we discuss issues of poverty and opportunity, we focus on those who have struggled and the issues and barriers that they face. But today, we are going to turn the telescope in another direction and look at those who have succeeded. And it is clear that some progress is being made, and the question is, what are the keys to success? To embark on this inquiry, we turn to three great contributors to the public dialogue of these issues, my friends and colleagues, Brad Wilcox, Wendy Wang, and Ron Mincy, who have written a paper published by the Institute for Family Studies that describes the progress being made in the economic fortunes of Black men. It is my hope that this presentation will inform and inspire. It should inform our understanding of how Black men and other Americans who face barriers of all kinds can make strides in improving their economic fortunes. And perhaps more importantly, it should inspire us to redouble our efforts to foster a culture in which people of all backgrounds have a chance to succeed. So let me first briefly introduce our co-authors, Brad Wilcox, Ron Mincy, and Wendy Wang, who will present their paper, Black Men Making It in America, The Engines of Economic Success for Black Men in America. Brad Wilcox is a visiting scholar at AEI, where he directs the Home Economics Project. Inaugurated in the fall of 2013, the research project explores the links between family structure and economic well-being in the United States, more specifically how marriage and a strong family life foster free enterprise and economic mobility. Ron Mincy is the Maurice V. Russell Professor of Social Policy and Social Work Practice at Columbia University and directs the Center for Research on Fathers, Children, and Family Well-Being. And I just say on a personal note, I've known Ron for a very long time. Sometimes it makes me feel very old. And he is a great colleague and a great friend. And when I went to New York City after serving as the commissioner in New York State, he gave me a great welcome, and I greatly appreciated that. So thank you, Ron, for being here. And Wendy Wang is the Director of Research at the Institute for Family Studies. She is a former senior researcher at the Pew Research Center, where she conducted research on marriage, gender, work, and family life in the United States. Now, after Brad, Ron, and Wendy present their report, we will have a panel discussion with our other distinguished guests, and I will introduce them then. So for now, Brad, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron, for that gracious introduction. And I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint here. Just press. Great, okay. It's very high tech up here. I feel like I'm the Starship Enterprise or something. So we're here to talk today about the report Black Men Making It in America. And before I begin, I wanted to thank Robert Doar for encouraging us on this particular topic earlier last year. And all of my colleagues at AEI, as well as my colleagues at the Institute for Family Studies, for kind of making this report possible. I think, as everyone here knows, much of the racial news in America in recent years has been sobering, if not downright depressing. Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott, Ferguson, Baltimore, and of course, Charlottesville. Writers and scholars like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Michelle Alexander have told important parts of this story, underlining the enduring character of racial inequality and racism in America, and the ways in which America's racial divide has exacted a particular kind of toll on Black men and Black boys. But one of the dangers with this racial moment in American life is that it can leave the public with an overly grim portrait of the state of race relations, and in particular of the status of Black men in America. Since Martin's killing, public attitudes towards race have taken a markedly negative turn. This bleak view extends to Black men in particular. Indeed, as we have talked to Black audiences about Black men, we have found that many African Americans now think that poverty incarceration, and unemployment are endemic to black men. The problem, however, with this racial pessimism is that it overlooks the good news that is out there. Today we are presenting some unheralded good news about black men in America. The truth is that most black men will not be incarcerated. Most are not unemployed, and most are not poor. In fact, millions of black men are flourishing in America today. And our new report spotlights two pieces of particularly good news about the economic well-being of black men. So what we can see here in this slide is that the share of black men who've reached kind of the middle class or higher goes from about 38% in 1960 to 57% in 2016. So clearly about 1 in 2 black men in America are in the middle class or higher now today in the United States. And of course that represents millions of black men across America. We also see when we kind of look at poverty, the share of black men who are living in poverty goes from 41% in 1960 to 18% in 2016. So clearly, only a minority of black men today, 18%, are living in poverty, as this slide here suggests. So this good news is valuable in part because it can correct negative depictions and attitudes regarding black men. And doing so is important because in the words of Alan Jenkins, the executive director of Opportunity Agenda, quote, research and experience show that expectations and biases on the part of potential employers, teachers, healthcare providers, police officers, and other stakeholders influence the life outcomes of millions of black males, just as their own self-esteem, identity, and sense of empowerment affect their ability to achieve under difficult circumstances. In other words, if more Americans, including black Americans, knew that most black men have achieved a modicum of financial success in this country, it might change the way that police officers, teachers, and employers treat black males, as well as boost the confidence of young black males regarding their own ability to realize their own dreams for success. Now, it's important to note that our new report doesn't just highlight the contemporary economic fortunes of black men, it also investigates the social and cultural engines of that success for today's black men. In other words, it poses this question: what routes are black men taking to making it in America? And here we evaluate a number of hypotheses. And the first three that are listed up on this screen here are kind of linked to what I'd call kind of a conventional approach to looking at race in America, looking at the role of, say, work and education and contact with the criminal justice system. And we obviously hypothesize that employment and education boost black men's odds. By contrast, some kind of contact with the criminal justice system would be reducing black men's odds of making it in America. We also wanted in this report to kind of extend our gaze beyond these more conventional factors and think about 4 other things that we think are also part of the picture potentially. One is the role of military service, kind of thinking about the way in which both the unique opportunities and commitment to racial equality that are associated with the U.S. military, as well as its kind of unique approach to marriage. In the U.S. military, for instance, there is no recognition given to cohabitation. So when it comes to like housing benefits, medical benefits, et cetera, you're either, in the military's eyes, kind of single or married. And that is conducive, we think, to a more marriage-friendly context, including for African-American men. In fact, the U.S. military is the one institution in America where there's no racial gap in marriage rates. So if you look at black and white enlisted, they're about equally likely to be married, which is, again, the only place in America where that's the case. We wanted to include the military in this work. Look also at the role that church-going plays in black men's lives, and we're focusing here on their early years, as well as the role that marriage plays in the lives of black men. And here it's particularly important to note that in African-American marriages, black men are particularly likely to be employed. And so that is an important source of income for the family for black males. And the final thing we're looking at here is a sort of a sense of agency. Yeah, and the question that we're looking at is whether or not black men who have a sense that they're kind of captains of their own fate are more likely to be flourishing in their 50s compared to black men who don't have that sense of agency, who are more likely to think of themselves as kind of being buffeted by their circumstances. So you can kind of see our hypotheses that we've outlined at the beginning of this project. I'm going to turn over the podium now to Dr. Wendy Wang to give us some answers about how these different factors are linked to black men's success by the time they reach their 50s.
Well, thank you, Brad. Thank you for all of you to come. So I'm going to introduce the data that we use for this study. It is the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, 1979 cohort. So basically, this is a group of people who were born in between 1957 to 1964. And the survey started in 1979 when they were teenagers and young adults. And then the last year it was surveyed, it was in 2014 when these people are in their 50s. For the purpose of this study, we picked the black men in the sample, and then we picked the 3 life stages for these black men. So when they're in their young adult, when they were young adult, when they're in their 30s, and when they're in their 50s. And income categories, as Brad already mentioned, it's straightforward. So we basically take everyone's family income, adjust it by their family size, and rank them. And so we have the bottom one-third, and middle one-third, and the top third of the income groups. So here's the overview of how black men's economic status changes over their life stages. We have white men here as a reference group. As you can see, that for white men, their economic status are pretty steady over time. And somehow for black men, you see more of the up and downs. And at ages 14 to 22, about a third of black men are in the middle class or higher. And the share goes up to 56% when they're in their 30s, but goes down slightly when they're in their 50s. And the poverty rate tells a somewhat similar story. And as we see that the black men are more likely than white men to be in poverty, but the rate goes down sharply. It's actually reduced by almost half when these men reach their 30s, but kind of goes up a little bit when they're in their 50s. Here's the overall picture. Oh, sorry. That's the poverty. And so here are some descriptive analysis to show how the different factors are related to black men's economic success. As you can see, we have black men's family income at a younger age, and their contact with the criminal justice system, education, work status, and all these are played in the way that we expected. And then at the same time, there are other factors at play in black men's lives. For example, the black men who have served in the military when they were young are much more likely to be successful, to be in the middle or upper third of the income brackets when they reach age 50. And at the same time, and black men who attended church or religious service when they were young and also more likely to flourish when they're in their 50s. And remember, this is over 35 years of the life course. And so this is interesting how their early young adulthood experiences affect their success at mid-age. And I want to mention about locus of control. So this is the measure for personal agency, as Brad mentioned. And a stronger internal indicates the person mostly think that they are responsible for their own lives. and stronger external indicates that the people think that the outside forces such as the luck or the fate control their lives. So to see whether these factors are actually have any predictive power in a multivariate analysis context, so we ran some models, and here we have 3 models. The first model includes the characteristics of black men when they were young, basically teenagers and young adults. And the second model, model 2, here, this is the whole thing you can see, include education and including education, work, and marital status when they're in their 30s. And the last model, model 3, include the same factors, education, work, and marriage, when they're in their 50s. So let me go back. So as you can see, these main factors we have introduced are highly significant in Model 1 before we control for education, marriage, and work. But after we control these variables, I will call the big 3, education, marriage, and work, and some have lost the significance. But still, if we look at Model 3, black men who attend religious service at a young age are still, more likely to be successful when they're in their 50s, and it's significant. And also, the personal agency is significant. Is related to a higher chance of them being successful when they're in their 50s. So again, this is after control the education, work, and marriage when they're in their 50s. So as you know, we have a lot of factors here in a model. So how are they related to each other? Why some variables work the way they were? We ran a model called path analysis, try to untangle some of the pathways. So basically, we look at the 4 key variables: the military service at ages 22, as of ages 22, and the church going at a younger age, and also the crime, charged with crime as of age 15 to 23, and also the AFQT, which measures the general knowledge of the black man. And we hypothesized that these factors kind of mediated by marriage and education and employment status when these men are in their 30s. And so the marriage and education and employment status later on affect these men's success at age 50. So for example, these models seems to actually work the way we have hypothesized. So black men who served in the military when they were young are more likely to be married when they're in their 30s. And then, when they're the people, black men who are married in their 30s are more likely to be successful when they're in their 50s. And also, the men who serve in the military are more likely to be employed when they're in their 30s, and then which in turn to be related to their success when they're in the 50s. So that's how the pathway works. And same thing goes with the crime, the contact with the criminal justice system. So if they had contact with the criminal justice system when they were young, they're less likely to get married later on when they're in their 30s, and less likely to be working, which in turn to be associated with a lower chance of being in the middle class when they're in their 50s. Okay, we also run the similar models for poverty to predict the chance of poverty when these men are in their 50s. I'm not showing the models here, but it's basically the same similar story, and it's also in the report. If you have time, you can check it out. So, in summary, about half of black men in the U.S. today are in the middle class or higher income brackets by the time they reach age 50. Education, work, and marriage definitely helps this process. At the same time, military service, church going, and personal agency also helps. What appears to hurt is the contact with the criminal justice system when they're young. So with that, I turn to Ron for some policy implications.
So again, thank you for coming. We conclude after examining these data that there are several critical things that we might do to ensure that the kind of success that we report here for this earlier cohort continues. First, to expand and improve the early childhood education for lower income children so that by the time they reach graduate, the time that they're graduating from high school, more are able to go on to college. Secondly, to reduce the over-incarceration that is currently taking place by reforming sentencing, making available more public defenders, and doing a variety of things to enable young black men to avoid contact with the criminal justice system. Thirdly, to extend the success of the U.S. military model to other institutions, particularly institutions in higher education or internships or the sort of career academies types of models, so that the military isn't the only sort of place where young African American men are able to move on into middle class or higher status. And then finally, to the role of the African American church and other religious institutions operating in African American communities to encourage those to reach out to more young black men and engage them, and particularly around these areas of family formation and family stability, to urge young black men to have children in committed relationships and especially marriage, because that is an important engine of being in the middle class as well. So I would say, finally, our report is really not meant to diminish some of the real threats that are occurring in communities of color, particularly the mass incarceration and victimization by the police. These are things that are ongoing challenges that African American men face, and our report is not meant to diminish them. Still, we want to point out that there is another side of the story, and often that is one that is neglected. And I would say that I became interested in this area more than 20, 30 years ago when, as a young graduate student, I was impressed by a book that was written by Jewel Taylor Gibbs at the time called Young Black Men and Endangered Species. And it really, having two young black boys, sons myself, that sort of launched my career out into this area. And I would have thought, as a consequence of that cohort was headed for a place of real danger as adults. These data that we're presenting here is pretty much in the same cohort. And so one of the reasons I was interested in looking at this is that that only told one side of the story. That prediction really is not didn't come to bear for the majority of black men that are in or near that cohort. And I think that part of the story needs to be told. So we need to encourage then the good economic news about young black men and about their futures as they go on, and to give certainly more hope and encouragement to those who are pursuing these paths having to do with personal agency, service in institutions that help them move into the middle class, and absolutely avoiding connections to the criminal justice system. And finally, I would say that a limitation of our study, of course, is that it doesn't have geographic data in the NLSY, and many of these policy recommendations are more difficult to pursue in communities that are high poverty communities. Nevertheless, I think the report presents some interesting and useful information in an environment in which we talk so much about the adverse things that are happening to young black men, and not at all the success that we documented here. Thank you, and looking for your questions and comments.
Why don't we do a few questions, and then we're going to have a panel of respondents come up and respond to the report. So we'll do a few questions, and then we'll shift gears. Yes, sir, you in the center? Or, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Sorry, thank you. So I had a question specifically about one of your variables for religious service. Really the theoretical implications underlying this variable. Is it the religious experience itself or the benefits of community involvement in that religious experience that confers the benefits that you mentioned?
So in terms of this particular measure, we're just looking at attendance for these black men in this cohort when they were younger, in their late teens or early 20s. And so we can't unpack precisely what it is about that attendance. It could be their connection to a social network of particular kinds of people that are helpful to them. It could be the normative message that they get from their churches. We've heard, like Elijah Anderson, the sociologist at Yale, has talked about kind of the code of decency being kind of advanced by the black church. That could be part of the story. Or it could be a more spiritual, story, that having a connection to their faith, helps to, among other things, buffer against the stresses of ordinary life and of racism in particular. So those would be some of the kinds of explanations that we might be able to kind of unpack in terms of church going. But all we can tell in this particular report is that the fact of church going in their late teens and early 20s was linked to more success later in life when they're in their 50s. Does that make sense?
Yes. So I also want to add that because these young men were ages 14 to 22, so a lot of them probably went to church with their parents, and so they're probably grow up in a family that their parents also attend church. Yeah.
Hi, I'd just like to clarify. It sounds like you're using African American and Black interchangeably. Is that what you're doing there? Okay. And is there any plan to not do that and to actually look to see if there's any distinction between how African Americans and other Black populations like Afro-Caribbean or African immigrants are treated or how they fare? Thank you.
So yeah, that's a good question. But remember, this is a cohort that was born in the 50s, and so they're in the 50s right now. It's basically the youngest boomer generation. So there are not as many immigrants in this population as the Black population today. So that's why, we didn't look at that immigration status in this report.
Hi, Gene Sterling at the Urban Institute. Congratulations. They often say the best research comes from asking the right question, not necessarily the work you do. And this is interesting that you've reposed this question in this way. I really congratulate you on that. And I've known Ron for quite some time now. When he first started working on this, I believe was your first book, Nurturing Young Black Males, quarter century ago, and got to work with you. So congratulations on continuing it. So my question goes all the way back to some of the first graphics on the gains for black men over time. And I'm just curious whether if that graphic had started in something like the mid-70s and dropped off the 60s and had done something like relative poverty versus absolute poverty, which is a fixed number, would those gains have been quite as significant? Well, I'm sure they wouldn't be quite as significant. Would they still be significant?
Let's see. So recall that we are looking both at the odds that they enter the middle class or higher and the proportion who are in poverty. And so I think that if you backdate it in the way that you described, I don't think it would have much of an impact, particularly on movement into the middle and upper classes. And I'm not clear how it would affect our measure of relative if we had used a measure of relative poverty. But what was interesting to me about these results is that they mirror one another. And that is to say that the same things that predict the likelihood of entering the middle class or higher also predict the sort of the likelihood that you don't enter poverty. And so I think the results would hold if we change the measure to relative poverty. So it's in the words of David Elwood, it does pass the smirk test in that they are very consistent across these two types of indices.
One more question from Bill up here, and then we'll go on
Yep.
to the next panel.
Hi. So just quickly, do you mind expanding on the your whole kind of model, on the U.S. military entrepreneurship model that you mentioned? I mean, does this kind of correlate with kind of? It seems like the timeline correlates with the franchising model in the United States, or kind of similar models that would help with entrepreneurship and kind of as a pathways program for minority youths or kind of underprivileged youths. Do you mind just expanding a little bit on that? You mentioned it at the very end.
Well, I think what was instructive about the descriptive data is that the proportion of African American men in this cohort who actually go on to college is relatively small. And so what we were thinking about is, so what alternatives for making it into the middle class were available to this particular cohort? And so fast forward, I think first of all, I don't think that diminishes the need to increase the proportion of young black men who end up going to higher education. Still, there are other ways to find those avenues, and I was thinking along in that vein. So Bob Lerman, for example, talks a great deal about expansion of internships. I've been talking to them so long. Of apprenticeships, other sorts of institutions where you can earn, gain some real experience that leads toward the development of human capital and be working in an environment that sort of encourages that movement into the middle class.
Sorry, we'll go with Bill now, and then to the next panel after Bill.
This is a terrific study. Thank you for doing it. If you wanted to do a different study and take locus of control as kind of the thing that you're trying to learn about, could you use what your findings to find out how religious practice, military service, and all of that actually influence locus of control? And if so, can you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely the locus of control is related to the other variables that we've looked at. But what is interesting is this measure is, we actually have two locus of control measures. One was measured when they're teenagers and young adults. One is measured when they're in the 50s. So what we use is the measurement when they're young, and then see how when they were young, they have more personal agency, whether that affects their success 35 years later, which is significant. Of course, when if we use the locus control in their 50s, and that's highly correlated with their success, because the people already made in the middle class and higher, they're more likely to think they're responsible for their lives, they're more in control. So, which is why I find that fascinating, that when these young men are 35 years earlier, then they have this stronger personal agency, but that affects their life 35 years later. So that's quite interesting.
But it is difficult in these data to disentangle what it is in their environments that give these individuals more locus of control, and we need to obviously think about that as well, placing them in situations where they fail, because one gains a locus of control from having to pick yourself up from failure, and so I think more thinking needs to be done about how to encourage. It's not clear that that's sort of born as an innate trait, or how much of it is an implication of the experiences that you go through and learn that you actually have control over your own life, and you're not always subject to the environment around you. Okay. Thank you.
Switch and actually keep the conversation going. To respond to Brad, Ron, and Wendy's work, we've invited three old friends to AEI who've been here before and who we've gotten to know over the years, and greatly appreciate your participation. And I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to have each of them do 3 to 5 minutes on their general reactions to the report. They've had a chance to review it previously, and then we're going to have a conversation on some topics, and then we'll open it up to the discussion. So first, closest to me on my right is Michelle Singletary, who is a nationally syndicated personal finance columnist for the Washington Post. Her column, The Color of Money, is an award-winning column carried in dozens of newspapers across the country. She's the author of 3 books and a frequent contributor to various national public radio programs. We're very glad to have you, Michelle. Ian Rowe, in the middle there, is a social entrepreneur and leader who has worked for more than 20 years in the public, private, and nonprofit sector. He is the CEO of Public Prep, a nonprofit network that runs tuition-free, public, single-sex elementary and middle schools that focus on putting their students on a path to college completion. He is currently a New Yorker, which we greatly appreciate having you here, and thank you for being here, Ian. And then finally, Bradley Hardy is an associate professor of public administration and policy at American University and a senior fellow in economic studies at our neighbor, the Brookings Institution. He also serves as a visiting scholar with the Center for Household Financial Stability at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and he previously served as a research fellow at the University of Kentucky Center for Poverty Research. So I'm going to start with you, Michelle, and what I want each of you to do is give kind of, how do you react to this? What do you think? And then we'll go into sort of more specific questions. You're first, then Ian, and then Brad.
So I was tweeting as you were talking about the reports, and I got a tweet from someone, Jason, who said, I feel like this is a pretty obvious thing. And and I felt like that, but what is important about this finding in this report is that there's data to back what a lot of us already know who work in the community. So I work for the Post, I write about personal finance, but I'm very involved in my community, and I happen to go to church every Sunday, and I happen to drag all my children to church and have since they were toddlers. In fact, I was thinking in my head as you were asking me to comment on this about, and someone asked what makes the difference in terms of when they go to church. We send all our kids to college, or have been and are, debt-free. And one of the rules of our family scholarship is that they have to go to church when they go to college. And they have to find some outlet at college that's religiously based, and I check on it. And if you go, you get our money. Because it's about our values. And I like, this marries, I think, the data with those of us who already know what works anecdotally. You know, I work in the church, I work in prisons, so every part of that I touched in my personal life. It was the military that launched my husband's father into middle class status, which in turn helped him go to college and be middle class, which in turn helped my family go from middle class to upper class. And so I really like this, and so as I speak and write, I'll be able to say all those things that you hear about black males is not true. It's not completely true. Clearly, there's still a lot of issues. And so that's what I like when you do things like this. It gives us the foundation to say that we need to approach how we deal with black males differently. And I would like to see more in the whole incarceration thing. When I go into prisons, I mean, what we think about those guys that are in there is just so wrong. And part of the policies that we need to implement is, first of all, not putting them warehouse in jails. And then when we do, how do we help them come out and find jobs and reacclimate to the community? And right now, we warehouse them and we forget them and we think they're monsters. And clearly, there's some people in there that did some really bad things. But there are a lot of men in there who, if we just give them the chance, can really elevate our community. And so I'm thrilled about this. I think it'll really help me in my work.
Thank you. Ian?
Good morning, everyone. Great honor to be here. As Robert said, I run Public Prep, which is a network of single-sex public charter elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Our schools go from pre-K to 8th grade. We have all-girls schools and all-boys schools. Our all-boys school is in a district in the Bronx in which if you're a boy and you start 9th grade, only 2%, 4 years later, will graduate from high school ready for college, meaning that you start ninth grade and you drop out, you don't finish, or you do graduate, but the degree, the diploma in which you've earned has not empowered you to actually do college-level math or reading without some level of remediation. And that's just one of many, many statistics that you constantly hear. I mean, earlier this year with the Chetty study, I think the New York Times had a headline, you know, the punishing reach of racism for black boys, and there's just this relentless message around black failure or black male failure. And after a while, if you're a young boy in the heart of the South Bronx and you're hearing these messages, it can feel pretty overwhelming. And you can start to feel, why even bother when the odds are so stacked against you? And that is why this kind of report is so important, because there are realities in terms of structural bias, but there are also entirely different realities for a group of men who are facing the same kinds of challenges. So that's very important. And as someone like me who actually runs schools, my orientation is always, what do we teach the next generation, right? Those young people in our schools who haven't yet made any of these determinations and are trying to figure out, how do I navigate in order to dramatically increase my likelihood of success? Because if you're an educator, once you have this information, then you have an obligation to teach this. You know, there are concepts such as the success sequence and other data, but when you hear about education, work, marriage have high correlations to long-term success, it's almost irresponsible for us to hold this information back from young people in our schools today. And you know, what's remarkable about the factors that seem to predict success for black men in America is how unremarkable they are in predicting success for Americans of any race, male or female. And that's just a really powerful message of this study.
Okay, thank you. Bradley?
So I really enjoyed the paper, and I would say that, you know, from my perspective, I've been thinking about these topics for 16 years and maybe longer when I was a student at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And Morehouse is distinguished because it's a all-male institution that is historically black in Atlanta. And we had a whole bunch of kids from all walks of life, economically and otherwise. And many of them went on to great success. And so I've thought about what are those factors? And it's even influenced my research to this day. And so, you know, I kind of echo the first two panelists in saying that a lot of the results are I guess, they're intuitive, but we need to document those results. And you know, my training is as a labor economist, and I think that, again, there's been a lot of work in this area, and at the same time, I think that this work has to be constantly updated because we have newer and newer cohorts coming in, and they have their own unique experiences and challenges. And so there's more to be done, and I think that this paper could be a springboard to some new research on determinants of success. There was a question in the audience that kind of goes to my reactions, though, which was to think hard about the underlying mechanisms that we're seeing here. The study authors confront some of the same issues I do when I'm writing a paper, which is to say, you get these associations, but a lot of our solutions might derive from thinking about what the underlying factors might be, right? And so if you take as given that we believe education matters, work matters, some of the interesting stuff comes in some of our questions about military service, marriage, for example. And I guess I want to kind of tee it up for folks on the panel and the audience as well. Certainly, if you think about something like military service, no doubt discipline, skills are going to loom large in influencing the capacity of young men, whatever their color, ethnicity, so on and so forth, right? But it's worth noting that in addition to that, military veterans have hiring preference in the U.S. labor market, certainly at the federal level, and there's no doubt that the private sector provides that preference as well very often, and I'd say deservedly so. Well, one policy implication could be that we think about many of our local employer-led models, where the employers think hard about training workers, and the employers at the local level are very involved in participating in hiring those trainees, right? And so you're talking about people who want to work, who are going to get those skills. Again, I think folks could have different implications from that correlation we see, but I just offer that up as an additional mechanism that's driving what we might be seeing there positively. And similarly with current marital statistics and childhood church going, just the reality that some, but not all of those young men benefited from the types of parents that you see up here, right? Who were doing the things, imposing the discipline, many of whom had the resources to put into their kids as well. Certainly when you think about current marriage, I chuckle and say that, women have a way of doing really good things, like keeping you from eating ice cream at 11 o'clock. So there's all sorts of positive benefits, right? And more serious ones, too. So, I'm going to land the plane here. But I would just say that in the policy implications, I agree with most, if not all, of what I read. I would add briefly that there was a strong link between family income and the subsequent outcomes of the black men in the study. And that at least leaves open a policy recommendation to think hard about what the social safety net is for these black men, especially when they're growing up, and at least interrogating that a bit more deeply. What are those resources for some of those men at younger ages when they're developing? What are we doing, and how can we improve that? So I have more, but enjoyed the paper, and it's got me thinking a lot about how some of my work actually fits in as well. So appreciate you.
So I wanted to ask about sort of the policy implications as well. What can we do now? And I was struck, Michelle, by your comment about how you communicate with your children, because I have children as well, and one of them said to me at one point in his young life that, gee, Dad, I think I'd like to go into the military. And I thought, boy, that would be really a good thing for him for lots of reasons. But I wasn't too sure how strong I should push that, because the military is a big deal.
Yeah.
It's a big commitment, and it's a serious deal.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, should we encourage that in any explicit way, or is the alternative to bring some of the structure and discipline of the military to other spheres of American life or other forms of service? Which would you choose? How do you react to either of those?
I think it's the latter. I'm a big believer that young folks should follow their gifting. And the military encourages a certain type of person, and that's great. I'm a little concerned about saying you should all go into the military, because we are putting our children's lives at risk, right. and certainly appreciate what they do, and I'm grateful for those who decide that. But that's just one path, and I think we need to be careful as we look at this study, not to say, well, that's what they should all do, go to the military. So now we're saying all our black men should be up front, and and
I brought it up. Yeah, to get that out on the table.
So, but there are some who that is going to be great for them. They need that discipline. But I agree with the other panelists. We have to have a pathway. We have to have many paths for our young black males. And I am a huge believer that we need to have more apprenticeships. We need to have more internships. I'm struck that when I go speak at colleges, one of the things I always ask the students is, how many internships have you had? And I'm really discouraged that many don't have them. They have jobs, but not internships, something that will get them into a job. And I think more colleges and high schools should encourage, that should be a requirement, I believe, that before you graduate from college, you got to have 2 full internships in the career path that you want to go into. And that certainly made the difference for me. I was working at the Baltimore Sun, which of course led me to the Washington Post, and I require, you don't want to be my kid, I'm just saying. So all of our children are required to have at least 2 internships before they graduate from college. That's my husband and our personal.
You gotta go to church. You gotta
Yeah,
go.
and you have to go study abroad. So they are also required to go study abroad. And so my oldest, who is now studying to be a social worker at the University of Baltimore, went to England, to Bristol, to study for a semester. Her brother, my son, has autism, so the challenge is a little bit different for him to study abroad, but we're looking for study abroad programs in which there's more, help, and he can, have some help while he's aboard. But he's already thinking. He's a rising junior at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and he's already thinking about where he's going to go. Even with his challenge, he says, "Mom, how are we going to do this?" And I'm thinking maybe a summer program, and Mom's going to go, because I'm that kind of parent. And my youngest is about to go to Towson, and she's already thinking about where she goes. So it's about everything. And so the big question is, should you push them? Absolutely. We ought to say that. We ought to be parents to the very end until they are in their full adulthood. And to me, a full adulthood is you have a full job, you're making all your money, and I don't have to pay for anything. And so I'm telling you what to do right up until that point.
Okay. So any other comments on the structure of the military? And thank you.
Well, I was struck, Michelle, it sounds like you're an amazing parent.
A little crazy.
I was struck by how emphatic you are in creating these rules for your kids in terms of the faith commitment, the number of internships. And I actually think it's emblematic of kind of a larger story, which is that the institutions through which children learn these messages are not typically the ones that we're learning them anymore. So you may have learned messages about faith or family formation, all of those things in your own nuclear family, but because of the explosion in non-marital birth rates, particularly to young women 24 and under, you're not typically hearing those messages there. You aren't necessarily hearing it in a faith institution because religiosity is down. You may not be hearing it in your larger community because you're not seeing other examples of stable families. You may not hear these messages in popular media. And so the question is, what's the institution that's left to impart these messages? And again, from someone who runs a network of public schools, especially in early education and middle school, I feel it's even more incumbent upon us to figure out ways to develop, developmentally appropriate ways to speak about these issues in our curriculum.
But, Ian, I have to push you a little bit on this because the schools you run are single sex. I don't know if they have the sort of no excuses charter school aspect, but there's definitely a level of structure that's a little different than your typical public school in America. And I'm just wondering whether that level of structure is part of the story here with the military, and you're getting it in a different way.
There's no question that to some broad statement, from a structure perspective, expectations, we believe we're being very clear with our kids. That said, when it comes to issues like marriage or military, those start to get into almost taboo areas. So there's no concern typically talking about education and work as being vehicles. College and career, you'll hear that over and over and over again. But if you start to talk about marriage or the timing of family formation or faith, these enter an arena that not all educators are comfortable talking about. And this, to me, is the big threshold that we have to cross, because it becomes an area that many educators just do not want to talk about for fear of marginalizing the families from which our children are coming or the situations in which they're in. But we have to gain that courage because the data is overwhelming. And again, I think it's irresponsible if we're not figuring out appropriate ways to teach this in our schools.
I love that, and I think that word you used was courage. There's a way to teach this without sounding that you're judging or moralizing. Yes. I mean, when I volunteer in prisons, I'm like, there was an inmate who was about to get out, and I was asking him where he was going to live, and he said with his girlfriend. I said, "You're not living with your girlfriend. You going to marry her? Because you're not living with her." And his girlfriend was there at one of the family visits, and I said, "You're not going to let him move in with you? He needs to get a job, and then you can marry him." And so, of course, I'm not a teacher, so I can be more bold.
Right.
But we have to be bold.
Yes.
And I think we can do it in a way that is not judgmental. And this report shows that it's okay to say, take your kids to church or whatever religious or community program that will help keep them stable. It's okay to say, young people, you know what? Stop having sex before you get married. And I know it's like, oh my gosh, you didn't say that because they should be able to do that. No, they shouldn't. And I'm not even saying that my kids won't, but they, from my husband and I, that's the message they're going to hear until we don't hear nothing else and we cover our ears, whatever you're doing. And, and it's the same thing. So we have to be bold and have the courage to say without moralizing that the data is clear. You go to school, you get a good education or a trade. You wait to have kids before you're married, and then also not just get married, but make sure you marry the right person. Take premarital courses. If the dude or the girl is not right on the first date, dump them. And just say these things. And say it with humor and love and compassion, and the kids will hear the message, and they will do it. You know that. You do this for a living. And I know people think, you can't tell people these days. You absolutely can tell them. And our parents told us, and we got to get back to that, to being bold, to say, it's okay to say this. Now, if you choose a different path, I'm going to still love you. I'm still going to support you. But I know that this path is the right way. And if you just indulge me for 1 minute, all of my children, the conversation we have about this in marriage and sex and all that is that there's a road A and there's a road B. It's great that your whole study is about paths. And I say, road A, you go to college, you get good grades, you go to church, you get involved in a campus community, you do all the right things that we know will make you successful. You can choose path B, you can have sex out of marriage, you can drink and do things like that, but we're going to love you on both paths, but you're not going to like path B because I'm a crazy mother and I will hunt you down and harass you. I'm going to love you, but I'm still going to make it really difficult for you. So which path do you want? They all raise their hand for path A.
Yeah, right. Robert, if you allow me,
of course.
On the topic of being bold, I would say that we've also got to push our local communities. And what I mean by this is that I could probably close my eyes and point to most metro areas, and if I look at current cohorts, I'm going to show you employment rates that are roughly half for black men versus white men, and all men pooled. And so certainly a lot of that's going to be pushing our black men to do better and be better. And yet, equally so, part of the military mechanism is that the military signals to employers that this is someone they can trust, and we've got to push our employers at the local level to take a look at these men. And then there's a lot of lost human capacity here, and some of that is just a lack of familiarity. At American University, so much of what we do is internships. And internships are really all about networking and building bridges. And so to the degree that you can get that internship, it's the pathway into an entire career. And so we've got to think hard about building those sorts of pathways for young men who, frankly, on the statistics, aren't going to come to the labor market with the same sorts of advantages that our kids will have. Right.
And speaking about, Michelle, not everyone has the benefit of a great parent like you. The question in the paper that I found most interesting was this issue of hope and agency, believing that they had a role in their life. And for those who don't come from strong families, and you're in the safety net system like I worked in, or the education system, how do you persuade young people at a very early age? And I know Ron specifically mentioned early learning, which is very early. To believe that they have a role in their future, when so many messages would say that the odds are stacked against you and you can't succeed in America. And I want to start with you on that, Bradley, and come this way. And not that I don't want to hear what
No, because I'll go on forever.
No.
No,
because of how you embark outside of a family.
Yeah.
Hope and agency. And I'll give you an example of something I did. It was a small thing. But I ran the social services, the welfare offices in New York City, and thousands and thousands and thousands of families came into those offices. Women and children mostly, but men, women, and children, but lots of kids. And I insisted, we used to always, it's a political institution, I remember it is the government, So there's always was a picture of the current mayor, because it was the city offices. And when I was there, President Obama was elected, and I said, well, we're going to have a picture of President Obama in every office. Now, I'm a Republican. But
I'm so sorry.
I know, yeah. but the point is, I felt that in that small way, I felt it was important for there to be a constant recognition that there's some good things can happen. And I just want to know other ways. How do you get hope and agency into people? And Ian and Bradley and all three of you, I'd like to hear about that.
Sure. So, I won't claim to have a silver bullet here, and I'm probably putting on my teacher hat right now. I think that one piece of this, maybe a small piece, is that people need to see wins. I say that metaphorically. And so encouragement and helping people to appreciate that their work has value, and complimenting that work. For example, there can be all sorts of negative stereotypes about working in sectors, take healthcare, for example, that have been historically perceived to be feminine, right? But this is hugely valuable work, work that's going to improve the quality of life, and work that's in great demand. Just thinking hard about the ways in which we can allow young men and people in general to experience sort of the affirmation and the kind of the feeling that you've done a good thing, and that can add positively. I would say, before I defer to the other panelists, that we also know, and this is some work from a colleague at Brookings, Randy Akey, we know that at the childhood level, there is a relationship, more work to be done here, between these measures of sort of non-cognitive skills, locus of control, perseverance, and actual family economic resources. And so we find that kids, in this particular study, kids who experience these negative shocks actually have adverse impacts on those measures, right? And so I don't think the case is settled on what that all means, but we have to think hard about what's going on with people in those developmental years, I think, as well.
Ian? That's good.
This idea of how to impart personal agency or how to develop it is one that's critical to our schools. I mean, we had our graduation ceremony yesterday for our 8th graders and our 12th graders who are entering some of the best colleges and universities in the country, and my overwhelming message in my speech was, you have power. You are going to confront a whole range of issues, some related to structural racism, but you could face any host of challenges. And the idea, though, is that your individual decisions, surrounded by a community that loves you, has a force greater than whatever structural barriers you may face. And a lot of our kids just don't hear that message enough. So that's something that's really important. Tactically, ways that we do, we build agency or comfort of dealing with uncomfortable situations is that we place our kids in uncomfortable situations. So beginning in middle school, our kids will actually go to places like Cornell University or Stevens College, where they'll spend a week on campus, living in the dorm, taking classes in an amphitheater with professors in a context in which they're literally taking a class, but it's a safe environment for which they can fail, right? Anytime you present a rigorous situation to a young person and they can try and screw up and it's okay, that is enormously powerful and educational, and we believe that those are the kinds of experiences our kids need to realize, so that when they do confront a challenge without a safety net, they have a much better sense of agency that they can handle it.
Yeah. I was sitting here thinking about what you said, the picture about Obama, and I'm getting teary because I remember, you talk about what a great parent I am, but you have to understand my background, not just my resume. My mother and father abandoned us, and we ended up with my grandmother. My grandfather was an alcoholic, so a lot of times his money didn't come home. And so in my black family growing up, my grandmother's primary responsibility was just to bring money home to keep a roof over our heads and the 2 pair of shoes that we had. And so she didn't have the capacity to say you could be anything you want to be, Michelle, because she just wanted to make sure we had enough food. And so I remember an assembly where the Reverend Jesse Jackson came, and he said, I don't remember all the things he said, but the one line he said back in that day, I'm trying to date myself now, is that I am somebody. And I took that message, and so it's not one thing. We have to involve the parents. We know from the studies that the biggest influence on children's lives is the parents. And so my grandmother was there. She was strong. She took us in there, but she couldn't take me to that next level. Reverend Jesse Jackson came in and told me I could be somebody. But within my school, there was a counselor who encouraged me to apply for a scholarship that sent me to college. I did not want to apply for that scholarship because I didn't think I was good enough. And she hounded me for weeks. And I said, get away from me, woman. I'm this little girl from West Baltimore whose parents abandoned her, and grandfather's alcoholic, and grandmother is crazy. I'm not going to get this scholarship. Why would they give it to me? And she said, you know what? If you get a no, you already have a no now, so what do you have to lose? And so it was my grandmother who took me in. It was Reverend Jesse Jackson that made me think big. It was that counselor who said, try it. You can do this. And so we have to stop thinking there's just one way. And we have to involve the parents, because you can't get the kids to, you teach them in the day, but the people at home at night are the ones that are really going to push that message even further. And so I love that you said I'm a great parent, but I haven't done it by myself. You know, my church is a huge influence on my life. My husband and I take marriage classes, and so it's all of that together that will rise these folks up. And if you know, it's so interesting when you said you're Republican. I'm so sorry. But I'm so dismayed at how we are talking about things these days, because when we lift everybody, African Americans, Latinos, even immigrants, we all rise. And so we have to stop thinking it's them over there, and black kids, they can't do it. They don't have the capacity, and their black parents had them out of wedlock. We have to stop doing that. I came from all of that. I represent all of that. I was abandoned. I was, all of that. But if we bring all of these together, that's how we do it. It does, putting up Obama's picture, that's great. But we got to now have other things in place as well. And so what I do personally is I write about this stuff, but I also serve. And I think we have to encourage all of you in this room. You've got this knowledge, you've got this data, you're very educated. Are you serving in your communities? Do you go to the schools and tell these kids they can do that? Are you serving in your church or your community group? Do you go to the prisons and tell these guys, I know you made this mistake, but you are valued? And so if nothing else, take this report, take the information. It takes more than the policy members, but it is a collective group that will make a difference.
Okay. Now we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. We have about 10 more minutes. Thank you very much, Michelle.
Sorry.
No, you don't have to be sorry. It's wonderful. Right there in the back in the blue. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you for your comments. I thoroughly agree with all of them about the role of the families and the parents in that. For those that don't have the structure of family, and Ian, this is maybe more for you, is what role could athletics play? Whether that's setting up mentoring with fatherless teens through a coach, or creating that discipline. Dr. Mincy mentioned opportunities to fail and becoming resilient to that. Obviously, there's lots of failure in athletics, so I'm just wondering what your schools do in that particular niche.
Sure. So I had the honor just last week of doing an event with Billie Jean King, where I talked to her about resilience and how competition helps, and we talked a lot about the role of athletics. It's important. It's another vehicle through which kids can be part of a structure with a coach. They're clear sort of meritocracy in terms of results. Like, there's a lot of correlation between results, working hard, teamwork, collaboration. So we see those things in our own, whether volleyball, softball, things that we do, first of all, our kids love it, right? So that's always a good starting point, that whatever you're engaging in with some higher purpose, from a kid's perspective, it's just something that they enjoy doing. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that athletics are not a component of so many core curricula, but we believe in it. We love the opportunities for not only adults to be coaches, but kids to be coaches, to have peer mentoring. So yeah, there are a lot of inherent values around athletics. I mean, one of the perhaps dangers of athletics is that in the current society, many persona that kids aspire to be are super athletes who don't always represent any of the things that we've talked about. So that is sometimes problematic. So so the idea of local athletics with local coaches, I think you get a lot more of the benefits of resiliency and competition.
As someone, I would want to just pop in on that because I both played sports in college and have children who played sports, and I've observed this. And I do think sports is a place where Americans come together in a way that they don't in other spheres as much. And it is a great opportunity to learn. A principal in high school I had used to say the best teaching often goes on the sports field. But I also think that too much of the sports culture has not been as beneficial to African American boys particularly as it should be. And in some respects, the idea that you have this wonderful hook, this beautiful game, whatever it is, in which you engage in a sport and you get all kinds of benefits from it, and you're not using that to foster greater academic achievement and an understanding of success in other spheres, because only a tiny fraction of athletes really succeed as athletics as a living, is a shame. And one of the things I'd like to look at is how we can both expose those athletic endeavors that don't do that, as well as celebrate the ones that do. But it's a good point.
Yeah.
So, Ron, did you have a comment?
So, just, one of the findings that was in the report that was surprising to me was there was an intergenerational correlation between the parents' economic status and moving into the middle class.
Yeah.
But there was not a correlation between being a poor adult, being raised in a poor family and entering poverty yourself as an adult. So this intergenerational transmission of poverty was not found in our data. Mm-hmm. And we couldn't explore why that was, but I think, Michelle, one of the things, I guess, my biggest reward from having done this is to arm you with stuff, because you're going to go out there and tear it up.
I sure am. Get married.
But so perhaps it's these other institutions, or other things that are going on in the community that can enable children like myself, like yourself, who grew up in poor families, to recover in a variety of ways. And all to say that we need to go think about what other things are happening, particularly in low-income, high-poverty communities, that can enable children who come from poor families to escape that destiny themselves.
I agree. And just if I could just run quick about the athletic thing, we're a geeky family, but I put my kids in sports, and I did not find that it was very helpful. Because the way we do sports now is all about getting somebody into the NBA or the NFL, and especially when it comes to the most talented. And I'm very concerned about how we play sports. And in fact, my daughter, who was a very gifted basketball player, stopped playing because she said, "Mom, the game is not fun." We went to one of those, I'm not going to mention the league because I'll probably get in trouble, but one of the ones where they, prepped them for the big league. And it was a horrible experience. She hated it because people were yelling and it was just not a conducive atmosphere. And she said, "Mom, I just want to play basketball for the fun of it." And so I took them out. And we do books, we do debates, there are different. I think we need to tell our black kids, you don't have to do sports. You could be a debater. You could work on the school newspaper. You could be in the math club. My son is a gifted math person. I mean, we went to Walt Disney one time, and another rule, they couldn't have little devices and growing up in phones and things like that, so they all had to have a book, right? So when we were at Disneyland, we were all in line, and everybody was on their phones, and all of my kids had a book in line, because you're waiting there for about an hour. What you gonna do for an hour? You better read. You're not gonna be on your device.
My wife was the same way.
So I personally don't think that is the most productive way for our black males. I think because the message isn't that you can use sports to be, the CEO or, work for a newspaper or work for AEI. It's like, oh, you got to be an NBA player. And we know statistically that they don't make it. And those who do, the majority of them end up broke at the end of their career. And I'm all about money, so I'm not putting them in a place where they're going to be broke.
Richard?
Congratulations and thanks to the authors of this report and to the panelists. And Michelle, especially thanks to you, because the next time my children complain about our rules, I'm going to send them to you. I think the substantive point you've made about the need for all of us to stand in our own shoes, to start where we are in our own institutions, in our own communities. A report like this is inevitably light on policy solutions because many of the things we're after lie beyond the reach of traditional public policy. But it doesn't mean we don't have agency in terms of what we do, starting from here, each institution, each community. So I appreciate that point hugely. My question to the panel is that we're in a difficult moment in terms of the politics of race in the US. I think that's an uncontroversial statement. And so I'd like your reflections on how we send out a very positive message about helping black men, giving more support to black men and so on, in a way that helps kind of build a broader political coalition. Whether we like it or not, a number of the people who voted for Trump think that actually there's more discrimination against whites than there is against black Americans, right? We may not agree with that statement. In fact, it's impossible to agree with that statement, but there is that view. The cutting in line narrative that we hear from Arlie Hochschild, to some extent the sense that because we've had a black president, there are some whites now who are saying, well, look how amazingly Hispanics and Asian Americans and black Americans are doing. And so my question really is, how do we construct a really positive narrative about black men and upward mobility in a way that doesn't alienate white, particularly lower income white Americans? Should we care about that? And if we do, what should we do about that?
Yeah. Bradley, you want to go first?
Sure.
Come this way?
Yeah,
and
sure.
We'll finish with you, Michelle, because you...
Yeah. Richard, that's a tough one, but I would say that part of it is about pushing some of the resilience narratives that we've been discussing here on the panel. But I think I would also add to that, for all Americans, we expect hard work and resilience, but then in return, what are the on-ramps for opportunity, right? And so I think that if you couch it in terms that are broad, I can show you statistics, particularly for rural white males, that don't look particularly good as well, especially if they're not college educated. And so there are instances in which there's similarities, and the trends tend to go in the same directions for non-college educateds. It just looks worse for black men. But I would just say that one particular path is to push the notion that, yes, you need to be resilient. My best students are oftentimes the one who failed test one, but I'm able to give them a path by which they can do well for the remainder of the course. Mm-hmm. They're motivated, they see what they did wrong, there's an opportunity to succeed. You can also discourage someone if they see no path. And I think in many instances, people look around their communities, they don't see a path. So.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. There's a lot of pain and suffering going around. In the white community, I think the numbers are, of all births of women aged 24 and under, 61% are out of wedlock, right? Which is a devastating number. If you think back to the Moynihan report, among whites, there was something like 5% at the time, right? So amongst 24 and under, 61%, which is just disastrous and has all sorts of implications. It just so happens that in the black community, that number is 90% for women 24 and under. But it's devastation all around, right? And so the implications of that in the black community are very similar to the implications of that in the white community. There's a reason there's an opioid crisis, right? There's a reason that the suicide rate amongst white men is skyrocketing, right? So in a perverse way, that creates an opportunity to talk about these issues across race. Because, again, as I said before, the remarkable thing about this study, it's not these behaviors around education, work, marriage, faith are not endemic to just black people. These are the ingredients of success for all Americans, regardless of race, male or female. And I think that's just a very powerful and hopefully unifying message for how we can move forward.
Yeah. I think we have to stop this sort of them versus us. The thing, I'm a part of a book club, and when Trump was running, everyone's like, oh, he's not going to win, he's not going to win. And I was like, he's going to win. He's going to win. Because he's talking to people who feel disenfranchised. And they felt that they were not part of the system. What they don't realize is that they thought it was because of us. But it wasn't us. We were all in that boat sinking. They just maybe were at the other level of the boat, you know. And so when we talk about them in such negative terms, deplorables, or, you know, that somehow they're not smart because they didn't vote for Trump. They were voting for somebody they thought could help lift them up. Now, they were wrong, but they still felt as if they weren't part of the system. But we aren't either. And I think if they hear us say that, it's both of us. Just what you just said, Ian, it's important that they have a path to employment as well. When they lose their jobs, it hurts us too. It hurts their property values. It hurts our property values. And if we all look at it like that we are in this together, and it's like when we're raising our children, you know, they all look at when you cut the pie, who got the bigger piece of the pie. And I was like, well, look, baby, maybe this time you'll get a bigger piece, but next time your sister might get a bigger piece, or your brother, but you all gonna have some pie. And so we have to understand that, yeah, the pie is going to be cut different ways, but all of us could get a slice of it in a way that will allow us to raise our families and not worry about health care or having food on the table. And that's how I approach it. Right? I mean, I've been the victim of racism. I've been in a newsroom where people thought I was there just because of the color of my skin. There's nothing like that when you walk in the door and right away they think you were there just because of the color of your skin. It devastates your self-worth. But I understand where that's coming from. They're afraid. And that's how I look at it. So when they say things like that, I said, listen, I did my work. I deserve to be here. But let's just do this together. And I think that's the message we have to say. When reports come out like this, they shouldn't see it as, oh, they're trying to tell us black people are better than they are. It's just, there's enough for all of us to slice this pie up so that we all have a decent living.
And with that, I want to thank our participants, our panel, our authors, and the audience. Thank you all very much.